It's the liability of being Gen X, I think, that I felt like when I was young that life was long and that I had a long, that my self-education was like a long process that I could really delve into, which was perhaps illusory, versus young people who felt like the sky was falling.
All right. Well, welcome to the Spencer Leonard Hour. This week, we're going to be discussing Marxism and Republicanism and the Civil War. Spencer sent me a letter that Marx wrote to Abraham Lincoln in 1865, or actually in 1864. And I thought I'd read it. Sir, we congratulate the American people upon your re-election by a large majority. If resistance to the slave power was the reserved watchword of your first election, the triumphant war cry of your re-election is death to slavery. From the commencements of the titanic American strife, the working men of Europe felt instinctively that the star-spangled banner carried the destiny of their class. The contest for the territories which opened the dire epopee was, if not to decide whether the virgin soil of immense tracts should be wedded to the labor of the immigrant or prostituted by the tramp of the slave driver.
Can I interrupt you?
Again. Yeah.
Maybe make some comments on this.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, this is a letter. It's written by Marx in his capacity as secretary of the International Working Men's Association. It's not a personal letter. It's an address by the First International to the president, and it's very interesting the way he starts. He's not congratulating Lincoln for his reelection. He's congratulating the American people for the reelection of Lincoln. In other words, for meeting the task of democracy, the opposed biformal democracy of the 4-year election cycle in the United States for president, to choose to advance the war to a fundamental conclusion and not to make peace. That's really what's at issue in the 1864 election is I wouldn't say peace versus war, but peace versus completion of the task. The second thing that's interesting is the way that Marx puts it. He thinks that that America, that the titanic American strife somehow is bound up with the question of socialism, that the Star-Spangled Banner carries the destiny of their class. And then he poses, in a sense, he's referring here to the Mexican cession, the territories that, the war that, the Mexican-American War involves a vast accession of territory to the United States, and it triggers the decade-long crisis begun with the Great Compromise of 1850 and the Fugitive Slave Act, which is the question of whether the virgin soil of immense tracts of North America should be wedded to the labor of the immigrant or prostituted by the tramp of the slave driver.
Right.
It's important to see that what isn't there is, the preservation of the ways of life of the Native American people. Right. That is not an option that Marx even acknowledges. Right.
Mm-hmm.
In a way that, today people, would just lament settler colonialism or something like that. And Marx takes that to be, that ship has sailed, that horse has bolted the barn, and he's not lamenting or celebrating it, but recognizing what the real question is. Right. Mm-hmm. The real question is ultimately imperialism or freedom, imperialism or socialism.
Wouldn't he celebrate it to an extent? Maybe not the way it was done, but the emancipation of Native people from a backward provincial kind of life, and to being brought into the dynamic and expansionist and free future of free labor.
I mean, I think that he would have a position a lot like, I don't know that he would have a position distinct from classical liberalism.
Mm-hmm.
If we go all the way back to Rousseau, there's an assumption that, look, bourgeois society, is going to destroy or absorb the Native American people. That the way that Rousseau puts it is, as it were, in a fair fight, the product of civilization would be completely defeated by the savage. Right, the savage has all kinds of sort of problem-solving intelligence and is strong and resourceful, and the product of civilization is bent out of shape by society's pliers and is largely incapable of taking care of his own needs, etc. But of course, the modern bourgeois subject never presents himself as an individual, but presents himself as part of a vast division of labor, is part of a whole vast society, and that society is going to overwhelm the Native Americans. Hegel says, at the first breath of Western civilization, the native peoples of America, fall like dominoes. I forget his exact metaphor. People like Benjamin Franklin and Jefferson say quite openly, look, there's a reason why Native Americans resist joining our society. Right? They resist it because we're unfree, because we've enslaved ourselves, and their society might be freer than ours. So what we need to do is to achieve a higher freedom such that they will freely join us. Of course, that's ultimately anticipating a kind of socialist conception of how pre-modern peoples could be integrated into world society non-coercively. That this kind of thinking goes on into the period of mass political parties for socialism, where they talk about, should socialist parties have a colonial policy, or would there be a non-coercive way of relating to the rest of the world if we achieved socialism, etc. So I think that Marx, knows that American imperialism, in the sense of the most, illiberal executive power, corrupt, monopoly influenced, corporate dominated elements of the American state, after the Civil War especially, are going to drive a brutal and genocidal clearing of Native American people, right? And obviously, Marx and Engels aren't in favor of that any more than they're in favor of, the brutal enslavement or semi-enslavement of colonial peoples through the brutality of war. But the question that Marx is posing here, of course, is the revolutionary, fact of America, right? That America has been a refuge for the victims of restoration and counter-revolution in Europe throughout the 19th century. And that the United States has stood as the only vestige, the only monument of the Enlightenment revolutions. The French Revolution has collapsed. Arguably, the English Revolution has collapsed, but the American Republic has stood, and it has entered into crisis, and that crisis is bound up with the fate of the entire modern revolution, and the European working class recognizes that. All right, so this is the idea of the American Republic as the last best hope of mankind. This kind of idea that the whole of Europe is sunk in imperial government. It's Louis Bonaparte, it's Palmerston, it's this, it's that, and the Confederacy has threatened the consolidation of that over the legacy of the 18th century Enlightenment, and the Union struggle is bound up with that. The reason why I wanted to talk to you about this is, precisely this question of the crisis of liberalism, and the way that the U.S. Civil War expresses capitalism. In that the crisis of capitalism, is registered as a crisis of free labor, not with respect to the social question exactly, but with respect to slavery. And so it's, is the American Civil War like a bourgeois revolution? Is it backward? Has the social question been posed in Europe, but it's not posed in America yet? And also, and this is at issue with the First International, what does it mean that this struggle in America is led by a capitalist political party, right, and not a independent socialist party, right? And yet Marx is, of course, clearly expressing his solidarity, right? What could be more poignant than he's directly in the name of the working class supporting a capitalist politician, Abraham Lincoln, in his re-election, right? Is Marx saying we should join the DSA and adopt electoral politics, right? No. We should try to move the Republicans to the left, right? It's really, like, this stuff gets seriously abused, right? Mm-hmm. There was an early issue of Jacobin magazine, I think issues 7 or 8. I might have it here on my shelf somewhere, that has like Marx and Lincoln like driving a car through the Red Sea together. Mm-hmm. Right. I don't know if you remember that. And later they had an image of a black soldier in a Union uniform right before, in the summer of 2015, celebrating the 150th anniversary of the end of the Civil War. And so this history gets abused, oh, look, Marx supported a bourgeois politics, right? And it's really a very complicated history, that, and with a lot of sort of, that's very fraught. But anyway, maybe we should read some more. Let's
read some more. Okay, so to go back, the contest for the territories which opened the dire epopee was, the contest for the territories which opened the dire epopee, was it not to decide whether the virgin soil of immense tracts should be wedded to the labor of the immigrant or prostituted by the tramp of the slave driver? When an oligarchy of 300,000 slaveholders dared to inscribe for the first time in the annals of the world slavery on the banner of armed revolt, when the very spots where hardly a century ago the idea of one great democratic republic had first sprung up, whence the first Declaration of the Rights of Man was issued, and the first impulse given to the European Revolution of the 18th century, when on those very spots counter-revolution with systemic thoroughness gloried in rescinding the ideas entertained at the time of the formation of the old Constitution, and maintained slavery to be a beneficent institution. Indeed, the old solution of the great problem of the relation of capital to labor and cynically proclaimed property in man the cornerstone of the new edifice. Then the working classes of Europe understood at once, even before the fanatic partisanship of the upper classes for the Confederate gentry had given its dismal warning, that the slaveholders' rebellion was to sound the tocsin for a general holy crusade of property against labor, and that for the men of labor, with their hopes for the future, even their past conquests were at stake in that tremendous conflict on the other side of the Atlantic. Everywhere they bore, therefore, patiently the hardships imposed upon them by the cotton crisis, opposed enthusiastically the pro-slavery intervention of their betters, and from most parts of Europe contributed their quota of blood to the good cause. I'll just go on. While the working men...
No, wait.
Okay.
This is Marx saying, as this is Marx being Marx, right? He's saying an immense amount here, right, in this one paragraph. So I think we better not lose sight of it, because there's a lot going on, right? First of all, what's really crucial is the theme of regression, right? That in the land, of revolution, America, right, where the Declaration of the Rights of Man, that's the Declaration of Independence, the impulse given to the French Revolution, right there, they've decided to where the Constitution was written, the great monument of 18th century liberalism. There, a revolution is taking place, not in the name of freedom, but in the name of slavery.
Right.
Not rescinding the old Constitution and maintaining not freedom, but slavery to be a beneficent institution. And indeed, addressing the 19th century question of the problem of the relationship of capital to labor, right? And that the working class understood, not because the status of workers was in question, not because there was an attempt to lower wages or lengthen the working day or otherwise directly affect American workers, but because the 18th century project of modern bourgeois revolution is being explicitly rejected and retreated from, as of course it has already been in Bonapartist Europe. The working class recognizes that the slaveholders' rebellion was of concern to them, that their past conquests were at stake. Just because an institution that's existed from the history of the world is now, in a sense, asserting itself politically, right? Slavery, and then the last sentence, he's saying, this is what's given rise to the First International. The working class has borne patiently the hardships imposed upon them because they can't work in the textile factories of the mill districts where Chartism and English socialism was born, because of the lack of cotton, because of the blockade of the Union Navy. And despite the fact that they're thrown out of work, despite the fact that their material interests are for the breaking of that blockade, nevertheless, they're enthusiastically opposing the ruling class that's trying to enter the war on the side of the Confederacy. And instead, the workers of Europe are immigrating to America to join the Union Army.
It's not out of some altruism that they are willing to sacrifice, but rather
No,
because they have a political understanding and a long-term political project which they're committed to, that they can withstand the
that's right.
short-term pain.
That's right.
Mhm.
But it does defy any crude material analysis.
Yeah,
Right?
and any
It has to be
crude,
understood, as you say, politically.
yeah, it's any crude, short-term, immediate material analysis. Like, it's not in their interest to not get caught
Right.
in the moment, but it's also
Right.
not in their interest to allow slavery to take hold and institutionalize itself and claim political rights for itself, and which down the decades would undermine their material interests and their political interests, in a much more profound way than the lack of cotton for a few years during a blockade in a war, right?
Right. So, this is the question: is like, why? How has the slavery question changed? Right. Why has the slavery question, with? I mean, look, the bourgeois revolution is a revolution against slavery from the beginning. But the fact that it doesn't abolish slavery everywhere at once at a stroke wasn't felt to call into question the freedom that it did achieve. In the case of the American Revolution, the fact that the American Revolution doesn't abolish slavery, even though it is an anti-slavery revolution,
Mm-hmm.
right, it is in the name of free labor, in the way that James Vaughan talked to you about at great length and quite eloquently a few weeks ago. It could be safely left to the future to overcome slavery in the plantation agricultural tracts.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It wasn't, obviously, some of these leftists today want you to believe that the American Revolution was for slavery. That's absurd. It resulted in a wave of abolition in the northern states as far as color caste slavery is concerned, in terms of the slavery of black people. But it also was a wave of emancipation for white people, right? It meant that all kinds of terms of unfreedom in labor contracts, of indenture and apprenticeship, et cetera, were set more firmly on the basis of wage labor. So now the question of slavery threatens free labor, right? That somehow this has to do with the relation of capital to labor in the core of capitalism, in the industrialized zones of the world, right? That the South promises to erect an industrial revolution on the basis of slavery, right? That in fact there are elements, of industrial production in the South being operated by slaves. So this is the question: is how how the slave of the New World comes to be an image of the crisis of the entire modern revolution. Sorry.
Yeah, it's great. No. So let me. So the next line, I think, is: while the working men, the true political powers of the North, allowed slavery to defile their own republic, while before the Negro mastered and sold without his concurrence, they boasted it the highest prerogative of the white-skinned laborer to sell himself and choose his own master. They were unable to attain the true freedom of labor or to support their European brethren in their struggle for emancipation. But this barrier to progress has been swept off by the Red Sea of Civil War. The working men of Europe feel sure that, as the American War of Independence initiated a new era of ascendancy for the middle class, so the American anti-slavery war will do for the working classes. They considered it an earnest of the epoch to come that it fell to the lot of Abraham Lincoln, the single-minded son of the working class, to lead his country through the matchless struggle for the rescue of an enchained race and the reconstruction of a social world. Signed on behalf of the International Workingmen's Association, the Central Council. And then there are the names of those who are part of the council.
Right.
So, yeah. I mean, that seems to just confirm what you had described just now about how the Marx and the International understood the significance of the Civil War and what it meant for the struggle for socialism.
Right. So there are a couple of things that, fascinate me about this. Obviously, like when we think about the task of trying to reconstitute the left in the wake of the catastrophe of the 20th century, we're necessarily thrown back on history and how we think about that. And one of the things that you at Sublation have been doing is thinking about liberalism and, civil society organizing. And you had a really wonderful discussion with James about that, about the American Revolution and it as a kind of precursor or resource for thinking about, of course, in the limited sense, the kind of pre-political organizing that you're trying to get off the ground with the campaign. And I thought, well, let's look at what it means to think about these questions when liberalism's in crisis, when we live in an illiberal world, right? Where we live in a world where rights of free speech, rights of due process, etc., are in crisis. And that's really what the American Civil War is about. The American Civil War is the first time that in the United States that the crisis of liberalism and the Constitution and the Bill of Rights is really faced. I was just reading Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist, escaped slave, and highly articulate abolitionist, who says, look, the American Civil War is a product of the denial or the crisis of the right of free speech. Right? None of this would have ever happened if abolitionist literature and newspapers and ideas had freely circulated in the South. Right? And there was a kind of blinkering of the South that, really fails to come to terms with the question of slavery because they break faith with, social freedom. Of course, there are all kinds of famous cases, right, of abolitionists being killed and their printing presses being destroyed, not even in the South, but in like Southern Illinois, Elijah Lovejoy in 1837. Laws passed that, anyone found circulating abolitionist literature can be killed, is subject to penalty of death. Celebrating, in effect, the self-gagging of society. And Douglass is speaking at the very height of the war in February 1863, when black regiments are starting to be organized and the war is beginning to take on a more revolutionary character. And he says, well, we could make peace with the South today on one condition, if they respected the rights of the Constitution. Right? If they allowed free speech in the South today, we'd put down our arms. Right, which I find it just like this is a kind of a voice of that 19th century period that is very clear that we tend not to think about now. Right, if you ask most people now, like, what's the Civil War about? They'll tell you about whites and blacks. Right, they won't talk about rights and blacks. Right, they won't talk about the denial of rights. They won't, the way that, I think of like the fugitive slave law and like, contemporary deportations, kind of kidnapping people, not sending them back to slavery, but sending them back to their own country. Just, the crisis of liberalism that we take for granted, right? The lack of due process. These are things that, I think if and of course the end game of the Civil War, right, raises the question of is there really progress? Right. On the one hand, the Civil War is the Second American Revolution. It's this immense, titanic struggle that dwarfs the 1776 as far as like the scale of the war, or the scale of the conflict. Of course, the amount of Americans who are sacrificed in war, and yet it doesn't exactly achieve anything. The Reconstruction fails. There's a kind of second slavery that prevails. It's that kind of question, that you see people grappling with now, which is, we had the civil rights movement, and the civil rights movement ended Jim Crow. But, in many ways, black people were better off in 1965. And the number of black families were, black people there was an explosion of literacy. There was, the growth of wealth from, 1920 to 1965 in a way that dwarfs, the subsequent 45 years. Like these sorts of questions, right? Like these ironies of how there never quite seems to be that progress is always illusory in capitalism.
Right.
Or that progress is the form that the new unfreedom, the appearance that the new unfreedom takes. Right. So both the lead up to the Civil War and the aftermath of the Civil War, it raised this problem of capital, but in a way that, perhaps is more relevant sometimes in certain ways than the European history that we might look at. Right. Because in the U.S. Civil War, for instance, and in Reconstruction, it's never quite exactly just a workers' question, right? It's the crisis of the whole project of liberalism, right? And that's something that a socialist party has to address. It's why, like if we had a socialist party, it would be credible that we were attacking the illiberalism of the Democrats and Twitter files and all of this stuff, and we were attacking the illiberalism of the Trump administration and its deportations and its demagoguery, et cetera, right? And we'd have an independent position from which that made sense.
Right. Which is what I'm trying to eke out, This is what I'm trying to establish, but I find myself constantly having to address the ways in which opposition to Trump's demagoguery, Trump's illiberalism is turned into service for the illiberalism of the Democratic Party, especially amongst my comrades on the left, those who would call themselves socialists, as a seem to line up behind AOC and Bernie Sanders yet again, even as these two figures expose themselves as entirely complicit with the liberal order. That not, which I have taken in my new kind of talking point is to point out that the Biden administration put us within range of a coin flip of complete nuclear destruction, by its own admission. So we're talking about an illiberal order which is truly deeply destructive, not just to our rights, but to our very being, possibly. And I feel maybe that's hysterical, but or maybe it just isn't very.
No, I mean what's amazing is, obviously, like when you look at the figures of the 1850s, and of course I'm acutely aware of this because I've edited Marx in the 1850s. That's the decade where I've read, everything that Marx wrote, which is a strange decade to pick with Marx. In some ways, the others are more interesting or more fundamental. The writings of the 1840s, the young Marx leading up to the Communist Manifesto, on the one hand, or Das Kapital and the writings of the 60s on the other, are more commonly studied. The only things from the 50s that people normally read are the things written at the tail end of the Revolution of 1848, the class struggles in France, and the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, and maybe the preface to a contribution to a critique of political economy. Otherwise, people tend not to pay much attention. But it's Marx in a period of counter-revolution. Right? And there's no party, right? It's Marx is alone, with Engels and, his wife, and Engels' common law wife, and, maybe a handful of people from the Communist League, like the man that he dedicates Das Kapital to, Wilhelm Wolff. But it's basically total isolation. And the great lesson, is we have to have a party. We have to be class independent, right? That is the lesson for Marx. And he's trying to do that with the First International, right? Which is an independent party for the working class. It's not like the Second International where there's sort of national sections, like there's the SPD and there's French socialism and there's the there's the RSDLP in Russia. Instead, there's one world party, the International Working Men's Association. But from a British perspective, for instance, and it's predominantly a British thing, it's Marx's attempt at winning independence from the liberals. And so, and of course, the liberals are supporting the Confederacy tacitly, and they have the support of the working class. Or politically, they're the only representatives of the working class. The working class is breaking with them on this issue of foreign policy, right? And Marx talks about it in the first address to the International Working Men's Association, right before this letter to Lincoln. The criminality of British foreign policy is leading the workers to realize that they have to take state power. Beyond their economic needs, there's this wider political issue of the criminality of their government in the world. And so, ultimately, like this comment that he's making about Lincoln as the single-minded son of the working class, like, is perhaps the most charged, like the most ambiguous line in this whole letter, right? Because Lincoln is the head of a capitalist party, right? But he's also seeing the Republican Party as one that might be split in this revolutionary moment, where, in a sense, the deeper stakes of the Civil War could split this Republican Party into a revolutionary wing. And to a degree, that happens. In the election of 1872, Horace Greeley, 68, Horace Greeley, who had been the editor of the newspaper that Marx wrote for, the New York Tribune, runs against Ulysses S. Grant. And so it's really two Republicans, and Grant represents the left wing. Horace Greeley, Marx's former editor, has split to the right. And that, of course, is the most radical phase of Reconstruction. That's when Grant sends, soldiers to defeat the KKK. The only time that really the U.S. government, made open war on white supremacy in the American South, in the most radical phase of Reconstruction. And the stakes, I would say that, ultimately, the revolutionary potential for this bourgeois revolution, this, what could be viewed as just a revolution for the old ideas of all men are created equal, becoming a socialist revolution, or feeding into a worldwide socialist revolution, that in a way that's defeated internationally, right? That would have drawn immense strength from, for instance, a French Revolution developing out of the Paris Commune.
Right.
The Paris Commune is a kind of international reflex of the U.S. Civil War, right? And the context within which that point of view makes sense is the First International, right? The First International is both writing to Lincoln in 1864, he receives it in 65, and Marx, of course, is stepping out to split the International on the question of support for the Commune in the Civil War in France, right? So it's this question of thinking about the crisis of liberalism as the basis for socialist political agitation, right? It's why your interest in these things, your liberal impulses, can make sense from the point of view of a struggle for socialism.
Right.
That a lot of what a campaign might do at a practical level is meet the needs that are arising from the crisis of liberalism.
Yeah.
Right. Even as it's propaganda. It's if we had newspapers and if sublation was a whole national project of newspapers in every town, socialist papers and magazines, a whole national cadre of intellectuals participating in it, what would they be writing about? They'd be writing about the illiberalism of capitalist politics. All right. And the failure of capitalist political schemes to address the social question, the hopeless inadequacy, how we have to oppose it all. So anyway, I don't know if it makes any sense.
No, that makes total sense to me. I'm couple of thoughts come to mind, which is the question that I have is, why isn't it the case that a publication like Jacobin can take this stance in any kind of effective way itself? I think it was where that Jacobin wanted to go when it started. And one of the epithets that's thrown at the writers that work for Jacobin, I know at least that Ben Burgess faces frequently, is that he's alleged to be or called out as just a mere liberal. And so for me, I guess the question is, how can we avoid becoming mere liberals becoming one-sided liberals. And what is it that holds back the left as it is from taking this stance, which, we've spent some time trying to understand and develop in ourselves, but which doesn't strike me as particularly difficult to reach. That the idea that we would try to stand up for society, protecting bourgeois right and the the rights of society as established by the American Revolution as our primary first order bit of business, seems obvious to me, and it in the ways in which the left fails to do so maybe seems a little less obvious to the left itself, and even sometimes to me. But so I'm wondering, what do you think it is that has held socialists back, other than, we could say something like, oh, well, the Popular Front or their alignment with the Democratic Party. But it does seem maybe there's an ideological block as well, or some sort of ambivalent relationship with the liberal rights. What do you think?
I mean, I guess, one way of putting it is, how deep does the question of something like the Popular Front go? How deep does the question of aligning with the Democrats go? What, obviously, like with Jacobin, it was extremely fraught. It was promising, no doubt, in its way. It attempted early on a fairly open, it attempted early on to serve as, and quite frankly, deeply influenced by Platypus from the beginning, as a place for the negotiation of the transmission of the left, right? So that the transmission of the left, of the legacy of the left from the boomers, from the new left, into the present, was really clear. And so they were publishing boomers, they were publishing old new leftists, in a curated way, not in a scattershot or random way, but on certain crucial questions. They were attempting to address, for instance, the question, they were publishing Adolf Reed early on.
Right.
They were negotiating this whole question, this whole issue of the black question going back to the Civil War, which obviously the civil rights movement itself was very much about the legacy of the Civil War. There's a reason why Martin Luther King speaks in front of the Lincoln Memorial, on the 100th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. And I think that they were, what do we think? On the one hand, so they're dealing with the boomers, and on the other hand, they're self-consciously millennial, right? It's youthful, right? The early issues of Jacobin, right? It's an attempt to be youthful and of the moment. And of course, in some respect, that's promising. In another respect, I think it ill-served them. We were talking before we started this stream about youth and age.
Right.
And one of the ways in which they heard the new left, right? They heard the new left tell them, and there were other venues in which this took place outside of Jacobin and before Jacobin that Chris has talked about in podcasts like the new SDS, where something similar was being done, which is, in 2006 at the new SDS meetings, the old SDS leaders were saying, like Bill Ayers and Bernadette Dorn, but others, people who had, gone down, the Maoist highway, people who had held on to a kind of Port Huron statement, like Al Huber, I think his name is, in their different ways are saying, don't do what we did. You don't have to make our mistakes. Now, that's a good thing to be, on the one hand, it's good to be told that. On the other hand, it's not very helpful for young people, but there was a frank confession that, maybe this is a legacy of ashes. Maybe there's nothing
why
here.
Why wouldn't it be helpful to be told, don't make the mistakes we did? Because the young people can't take up the reality of what those mistakes were or see what they were very clearly, and neither can the boomers. Is that maybe the problem?
Right. I mean, ultimately, there is no lesson, right? In the sense that, certainly being told don't do what we did doesn't tell you what to do. And when you're 20 years old, somebody's going to tell you what to do because you don't have a clue.
Right.
Right. And, as precocious as these young people were, right, as precocious as Bhaskar Sankara was, he had a deeper engagement with the history of the left at his age than I did. I would say at his age, there maybe Chris Catrone and Richard Rubin had thought about it in my generation in a significant way. I certainly hadn't. The lesson, the way that they think about it, I mean, there are two things. One is the desire to change the world. There's a kind of a millennial doom, a kind of a why can't we have good things aspect to the millennials, right? Their children, that becomes more pronounced. I think there's a narrowing of horizons almost immediately with the 2008 crisis. The 2008 crisis, foreshortens their life prospects as young people. As middle class people, right? The middle class, of course, is deeply affected. It shrinks. The ability to be middle class seems more fraught. And of course, that's real. That's not something that just, commitment can overcome.
Right.
But at the same time, it's not really something that you can fix as a leftist.
Yeah, or as a socialist.
As a socialist in that moment, like, what are you going to do? Right? You're living in capitalism. You don't have a politics. There's no power. There's no organization at all. The left is completely irrelevant. And the desire for relevance is a trap, because it can mean that what you want is to control state policy. Right? If only we had universal health care. Right? If we had universal health care, it would be easier to organize. People wouldn't be so desperate. They wouldn't be so abjectly compliant with their boss. They'd be more willing to take risks, unionizing, if they didn't have to face
that was clear. Even at the time, Spencer, even at the time, that was clearly not the case. Because while the struggle for universal health care was going on in the United States. In the UK, an attempt to hold on to the NHS was happening at the same time. And the struggle for socialism was no stronger in the country which had had a socialized medicine for generations. You know, it was not.
That's right.
It was clearly not a panacea.
That's right.
Socialism, and it wasn't just there. You could look around the world. You know, one of the points that people want universal health care will make is the United States is backwards. Every other developed nation has universal health care or socialized medicine to some degree or another. And where is the socialism that's coming out of that? Why are the working class just as immiserated and fractured as in the United States in those other countries? I mean, it just clearly, for me, having been through as a Gen Xer, the struggle for universal health care again and again, being offered up over and over again by Democrats as something to organize around for my entire adult life. There was nothing impressive about that particular demand, nor particularly compelling about it. And as 20-year-olds, why are you so concerned? You're fine. You know, like,
right.
You're not gonna.
Right. I mean, look. No, absolutely. There's obviously these are symptoms. These are dodges, right? People don't know what they're struggling for, right? They, were we really struggling to end the war? Right? I would say no. We're not struggling to end the war, right? We're not struggling for universal health care. We're not struggling to get a black president. We're not struggling for anything. We're struggling to rebuild the capacity in society for independent politics. That's actually what we're struggling for. The only progress that's possible is the deepening of the capacity of society for its own self-determination, for the self-determination of working people. That's a really hard one, right? That's a really hard one because there's no, there's no, first of all, it's hard to gauge. And the more you withstand the election of Barack Obama and his fake anti-war message, the more you withstand, the fake appeal of Obamacare or a Bernie radical project, right? The more you face the depth of the task of building socialism in the United States, right? The more you realize this isn't the thing, this isn't the thing, this isn't the thing. Well, what is the thing?
Right.
Well, right. We need to build a socialist party, and we're not ready to do that right now. So we have to engage in some sort of pre-political something or other to get to the point where we could have a very weak socialist party, right? Et cetera, right? That the scale, and why don't we have a socialist party? Don't we have exploitation? Aren't the workers driven to it by their own self-interests? And yet we haven't had it in generations. Socialism is gone from living memory, right? That all, in other words, there's the depth of the crisis is intolerable. Right, it's too vast, right, for to confront in a kind of a daily conscious way.
I want to compare for a moment. This is stuff that I know fairly well and within my living memory for sure. The difference between the 90s Generation X and young millennial left, which came up really around, let's say it started to really get its legs in like 97 and had a moment in '99 with the WTO protests, right? And then compare that to the millennial left's big moment, which was Occupy Wall Street, and how you can actually see the first left, the Gen X left, reflected in the millennial left and around Occupy. But what came out of Occupy was more serious than what came out of WTO with the WTO protests, I think. But what they did, what people did, what I did, what I participated in around the WTO protests, which then became the anti-war movement in its first iteration after 9/11, before what you and Chris would talk about, before the new SDS, before the anti-war movement. It was the early, before the war even started. What we did was we used protest politics to try to build a network of like-minded activists, which would then confront the state and confront capitalism, and reflect on it through this now newly emerging internet-based network of publication. There was something called indie media. And people would find out where the next protest was. They would write about their experiences. There was a national indie media, and then there was city by city indie media.
It was INDY media.
Yes.
Right.
Indie media. Do you remember that?
Yep.
Yeah. I don't know if it still exists. It may still be there somewhere, and people may still, some old people, or who knows, maybe still using it. But it was important, and it was an attempt to build an independent politics. But it was an independent politics that really had one mode. Maybe there were a few others, but once you started going towards anything other than protest politics, you were just turning into some sort of influence campaign on the Democrats. And which is why protest politics were thought to be much, much more attractive, because they weren't seen to be about trying to influence the Democrats, even though often enough that's exactly what they were. So that happened, so that was kind of pre-political work, but it had this approach through protest politics, which really was very constraining, and kept it within the domain of capitalist politics ultimately, and also kept it as a kind of subcultural politics. Then Occupy Wall Street happened, which was like the ultimate flowering of that kind of politics, right? It's like the big moment for that. And it came out of Adbusters magazine and the anarchist milieu, which had been so important to indie media. But it fell apart very quickly. But that experience led the millennials to say, let's be serious. Let's break from this, what I guess you and Chris would call anti-politics. And they did not start to do serious civil society organizing work. And even as they claimed they were doing so, like the way Occupy Wall Street broke up, what they decided to do was turn towards local action. And
right. I mean, I would say that Occupy was. I agree with you that there's a continuity between the '90s left and the early anti-war movement. And there was an anti-war movement before the moment of platypus that, of course, Chris and I will emphasize. From 2001 to 2006, of course, there were massive demonstrations all over the world. I would say a couple of things. What happened in 2006-ish was that certain recognitions, after the defeat of John Kerry. After the fact that John Kerry hadn't really opposed the war, the Democrats hadn't opposed the war. I think like Senator Byrd opposed like the war authorization, like whatever opposition there was to the war politically was conservative or idiosyncratic, shall we say. What happened was that the old anarchist protest anti-globalization movement, and even like the sort of pseudo-Marxism of like the ISO, which was very much a kind of an activist-y pseudo-Trotskyism, which came to be very strong in the 90s because it had an anti-Soviet Union position. It celebrated the fall of the Soviet Union as a defeat for totalitarianism, right? And in that sense, it grew in the 90s. Both James Vaughan and I, encountered the ISO. I think James was recruited for a brief time.
Yeah, I had friends in the ISO.
Right. They were strong, and they were out there, and they had Marxist books on their table, but they weren't really teaching you anything about Marxism. And so that was the left, and it came. It's very interesting to think about, why that was disrupted in like 2006-07. Right? What's significant about the moment for Platypus is that an older preoccupation with Marxism, like all the old Marxist organizations, started to really, hover around the anti-war movement. And in that sense, the question of the anti-war movement, like what I was saying before, like what's it really about? And the anti-war movement was fraught from the beginning, because who are we in solidarity with in Iraq, right, et cetera, right? How can you oppose the war without supporting the opponents of the war, the enemy, as it were? The enemy was not leftist in Iraq or Afghanistan. So it was kind of a purely troops out kind of gesture. And that was already a problem. But I think the issue of like, what really are we trying to do? And what would it mean to have a left in America? And what was this old project of building a new left in America about? What were the 60s about? Who are these old people that are out here selling this newspaper, right? Have they wasted their lives, right? Or are these young people, is transmitting the left to these young people the whole point of the 60s and 70s?
That question, right? Have they wasted their lives, is one that never occurred to me as a Gen Xer, because I assume that everyone's lives are being wasted, and so if they were wasting their lives, they weren't wasting their lives any more than the people in the movie American Beauty, or you know what I mean, like than any other American living in the suburbs was wasting their life. So the only question for me was, are they hypocrites? Not, are they wasting their lives? Are they not really trying to do what they claim to be trying to do?
I mean, is it an exercise in virtue signaling, as the young people would say?
Right.
Or is it actually a substantive political project, right? Is it what it claims to be, right? Is it a struggle for socialism? Right. I don't think that we as Gen Xers pose that question enough, and the millennials did pose that question. Right. And in that sense, there was a more authentic reckoning. With Occupy, it was kind of a resurgence of that 90s moment. It was like David Graeber was like, what are these Marxists around here doing? Like, we can't let this happen. Right.
Mm.
And it was a kind of resurgence of 90s anarchism and anti-partyism and so forth.
Mm.
But I think in the failure of that, in the aftermath of Occupy, in the re-election of Obama. In 2012, there was really a question. Obviously there were international events as well. There was the Syriza crisis in Greece.
Mm-hmm.
That something of the old project of, which I think Jacobin had already raised with its kind of DSA DNA,
Mm-hmm.
right, with its Harringtonian DNA, had already raised in however inadequate a form, because their earlier efforts had been inadequate. The realignment strategy in the 60s and all of this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
The question of a socialist party in America was reposed. I think in a way that certainly I think Platypus tracked. We were very aware of our own internal pedagogy, I think, developed within this context. Like, what is the question of a political party for socialism? What is the goal of such a party? What is the relationship of a political party? Historically, what was the relationship of political parties for socialism to the political goal of the dictatorship of the proletariat?
Mm-hmm.
These kinds of questions. What was the old logic of socialist politics? What was that about? And why are we haunted by it? Why are we reaching for it? Why is this history, unfinished and kind of summoning us in a certain way? However reluctantly the living were to hearing that, demand of the past, and in that sense, facing that history. So I think that there was a new engagement with the 19th century. There was an engagement with the history that we're talking about. I've talked about how Jacobin tried to do that. There was an engagement with Eugene Debs and the old SPUSA as a model for what socialist politics might look like in America. What American Marxism might have been about. And so I think that, all of that it's a very fascinating question, how history comes to bear on the consciousness of the present. What the relationship of like professional historians or artists. Earlier in the week, on Tuesday, I did a podcast on the movie Glory, which is a favorite of Platypus's. We screen it. We often do like an American Revolutionary film screening, a film series, and that's always on the list. And that in that podcast, I was addressing the question of like, how is a film like that possible in 1989? That film is a critique of Black nationalism, right? It is a critique of, I remember one of the things that Chris talked, my dear friend Chris Catrone has had a deep influence on me. I like this. I would like to think that it's mutual, but I certainly know that he's had a deep influence on me. And one of the things that he said to me very early on, it was probably his Spartacus self, that just piped up with this. He said, Black people in the uniform of the Union Army probably did more for to advance freedom than anybody in the 20th century.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right. And, those kinds of things, are just like, they just cut through, right?
Mm-hmm.
All the 20th century's bullshit. Right. And, it's how, this is, it's around that time that I began to think deeply again about something that I'd always been engaged with, which was 19th century American history. I always had a love, for me in my history classes, like we never got past World War One.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I don't know what it was like wherever you were, Colorado Springs or where you were when you were in middle school and high school. But for me, it was the American Revolution and the Civil War. That's all that you studied in American history.
Right. Yeah.
And God bless, I'm really grateful to my teachers because there's just more to say.
I think what kids today study is the civil rights movement. And that's all
right.
they study. Yeah.
That's all they study. And
yeah.
that zeitgeist is, deeply problematic.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so, there was something about the crisis, I think the crisis of the left in the 1980s, where the legacy of the civil rights movement, look, I think in some ways it was good, right? I think you and I think Gen X has a, sorry, I'm chewing my nicotine pouches here because I'm a drug addict. I'm trying to quit smoking. But I think the fact that it's just about electing black mayors, that it's just going to be Andrew Young in Atlanta. And I forget the guy who was elected in Philadelphia who bombed, the MOVE headquarters, if you remember that, in 85, or Harold Washington in Chicago in, I believe, 83, or at the end of the decade, David Dinkins in New York City in 89. Or it's just about, wanting to be like Mike, on the one hand, like I really don't want to denigrate that, right? Like the world, like, remember when Vanessa Williams was like Miss America and Michael Jordan, everybody wanted to have Air Jordans and everybody wanted to be able to moonwalk like Michael Jackson, right?
Yeah.
Like white people were moonwalking in the 80s, right? I
took a breakdancing class in Colorado Springs,
right?
All filled with white people. But I went to a junior high and high school that was mixed, and where the black people were there, and none of us could. The black kids would come out and break dance, and just everyone would stop and watch them, and the whole dance would stop to watch these kids spin on their heads and do all sorts of stuff.
But there was like the Beastie Boys phenomena, right? There were like the white kids that could do it as well as the black people, right? And it was the prevailing pop culture. And, we were starting, we wanted to date each other, right? And we wanted to be free. There was a post-racial moment, even as it was like the horror of Reagan's America. And there were all kinds of atrocities, right? It was both a kind of resurgence or, it was both a kind of a right-wing retreat. And that's what the left would emphasize, right? That the 80s were defeat, right? But there was also the consolidation of the civil rights movement as the new capitalism, I would say, right? As neoliberalism. That
let's wrap this up and go to the parrot room now, because when we can talk about all of our Gen X misery and the more current and some current events and also the more recent history, some more in the parrot room. But on the way out, I'll just. I
just wanted to say that there was before you run Michael Jordan, be like Mike. I'm just trying to say that there was a reckoning with the new left and the civil rights movement as a kind of a deep undercurrent that you see expressed in a film like Glory, right? Or you see expressed in American history written at that time, which is generally better than the way it's written now, right? Where a kind of a memory of a revolutionary integrationist legacy, and a more deep sense of the possibility of something more having come out of the 60s than actually did come out, was felt.
Right. All right. Well, here we go.
Yes.
Here.
Sometimes I dream that he is me. You got to see that's how I dream to be.
I dream I move,
I dream I groove.
like Mike. If I could be like Mike.
Oh, if I could be like Mike. Like Mike. If I could be like Mike.
Be like Mike.
Be like Mike. Be like Mike.
Yeah, I try. Just need to fly.
Just one day if I could be that way. I dream I move. I dream I groove.
Like Mike. If I could be like Mike. I'm gonna be like Mike. Like Mike. If I could be like Mike.
Be like Mike. Like Mike. If I could be like Mike.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons help to make sure that Sublation Media can continue to provide interviews, videos, books, and articles that are critical of the left from the left. If you are tired of remaining stuck within bourgeois ideologies and politics, help us sublate them both.